Hi, this is Dr. Derek Grier. Welcome to Both Sides Magazine, the place where faith and politics intersect. Today I have with me two very special guests. I have with me Pastor Derek McCoy, President of the Maryland Family Alliance. Would you give him a warm welcome?
Thank you. Thank you.
As well as Mr. Shelton, Hilary Shelton, forgive me, of the NAACP, the Vice President for Advocacy. Would you also give him a both sides welcome? Tonight we're going to talk about the role of the church in politics, but before we get started, let's listen to what folks are saying.
Well, I think that religion should be kept separately because certain countries there are a lot of different religions in a country, and if the church takes part or any religion, then it might not be fair for other people in different religions, or other people may have an advantage. So to keep it fair, I think they should not.
I just agree with Jane that there's so much religions, and if one religion had an advantage, then people might disagree and start riots.
I think that prayer should have a role in politics. We do nothing without answering to God. So if we ask Him to give us the mind and the thought of being able to have the wisdom to do the right thing, then we'll make a good choice, I think.
I think the church should not influence people whom to vote for, but I do believe that we should vote because people died for us to have the privilege to vote, and I think we should exercise that right. I think we should seek wisdom from God as to whom we should vote for.
I believe the church and state should be separated because our country was founded upon the beliefs of our founding fathers, and one of the major basis of that was the separation of church and state. That's what they came here for. That's why they made the colonies, and I don't think we should stray from what they set out for us.
Very good. Let's expand on that last statement by the gentleman in the video clip. He talked about the separation of church and state. I want to hear what you guys think. What do you think of the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson in particular? What do you think he meant by the separation of church and state? Let's begin with you, Mr. Shelton.
Well, there's a historical backdrop. Don't forget, the separation of church and state is something that really came out of responding to the challenges many people had coming to our country from European countries. Good example is you think about the life of Henry VIII. We're talking about a couple thousand years ago now, but Henry VIII decided that he would actually create a state church so he could have more control over the people and whatnot, but also so he could actually win battles against the Vatican. At that time, the Catholic Church is much more powerful in England. There's some things he wanted to do and didn't want the influence of the church to interfere with, so he created his own church. In essence, a theocracy in many ways. If you think about those challenges even now, some of the theocracies throughout the world, those that only tolerate their particular religious beliefs but no one else's. So I think what he meant was almost like a two-way mirror. In essence, on one side of it, the church, the government should not be able to interfere with the actions of the church.
Sure.
Yes, people should be able to have whatever beliefs, whatever they thought, whatever was in their hearts, whatever God they decide to serve, they should be able to do that. And the government should not be able to interfere with it. But it didn't mean that the values of those people of faith, us, should not be able to be prevalent as we move forward. When he speaks of the church, he speaks of it as an institution. An institution in too many countries very well actually controlled everything, and anyone that didn't have that particular faith belief had problems. The way to think about it now is most people say we believe there should be more involvement of the church in politics. What they really mean is my church and my beliefs should be what runs the politics, but the minute you mention somebody else is actually being that faith community in charge, they change their minds.
Sure. Pastor McCoy, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the backdrops of that, even when you mentioned Thomas Jefferson in particular, when he was writing his letter to the Danbury Baptist Association, it was a real concern for him to understand, hey, the church is starting to overreach and beginning to overreach within their context. And so he said, you guys need to step up to the plate. You guys need to be more active, more involved, more engaged. And so it was an encouragement to those folks as he was writing for them to really get involved. I think the other thing that I always say about the church's involvement, and I hear this all the time, and that's where really that Danbury Pastors Association letter was really where that wall of separation came out. But I think the other side is that very similar to what Mr. Shelton was saying, is that we have to understand when you're dealing with the separation of church and state, one, that's really not necessarily in the Constitution. But what we are saying is that the government should not over-involve itself into the life of the church. But here's the thing. The citizens who go to the church, you, I, our friends, our families who are involved in churches, should not take themselves out of the equation of being in the public square. We have to be engaged in society. We have to be engaged in democracy, regardless of which side of the aisle you sit on. If you're sitting in the center like myself, you got to understand that you have to be engaged. And he never talked about we're not supposed to now not be engaged because we go to a church.
Very good. So, that's very good. So we agree largely on this subject. Very good. Here's another question we received on the web. Do you think a church or a faith-based organization's dependence on maintaining tax-exempt status somehow limits their ability to operate without government interference?
Well, there are a couple ways of thinking about
Sure.
it. Of course, as a C3 organization, and most churches are C3s,
Yes.
of course, allowing their members to be able to deduct whatever funds they contribute to the church, at least some portions of it, from the taxes they would normally have to pay to the government. In essence, what we have then is that savings that benefits the church actually coming from the government. So there's that involvement along those lines. C3 organizations are prohibited from endorsing political candidates or political parties.
Yeah.
And that is the reason why. And we appreciate that. Because in essence, what you'd very well have is, with that deduction, you'd have really governmental funds, or funds that would otherwise be relegated to the government, being utilized to advance a particular political party or candidate. So I appreciate that. That doesn't, however, get in the way with the church still being actively involved.
Sure.
And quite frankly, the NAACP is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We do not endorse political candidates nor political parties. But quite legally, we have an agenda. And I would also argue, quite frankly, that it actually gets in the way of our advocacy. If I had to worry about petty party politics between one political party and the other as we move to advance an agenda, I want support from everyone. And I think in many ways the church would have that as well, and that coverage. It's not to endorse someone, it's not to endorse some party. It's to make sure those policies, those beliefs that we have, can very well become reality through the government structure.
So why in this instance does the separation of church and state not apply when it comes to this particular matter?
Well, see, I have a slightly different take, but very similar. But I think what we got to understand, if we go back a little bit historically, the church did have a voice, and they were not necessarily threatened by their 501c3 or their tax-exempt status for quite some time. And it wasn't until our wonderful then-running Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, who was running for senator at a certain time, said, well, hey, guess what? I'm going to, there were people that really, and he would look at it as Christians, that were kind of bombarding him during his election, saying, they don't like this guy, he didn't do this. He kind of vowed to himself, if he ever got elected, that he's going to change that issue. Well, guess what? There was an omnibus type of bill that was passed back in when he got into office, and basically he added to it, and it's called the Lyndon B. Johnson Amendment. That Lyndon B. Johnson Amendment absolutely goes against one of the core principles of our Constitution. The First Amendment clearly states, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, abridging the free speech. And so if you understand what Lyndon B. Johnson did, he put a bill in on top of another bill. So it wasn't even a bill that dealt with that issue at all. It had a whole bunch of other things. And it was called down on the Hill that said it was a rider. And so it was riding on these other bills. And therefore, it silenced the church. It silenced, to me, in my perspective, the voice of the church. And I think it's by fear, by intimidation, by saying, if you speak out, you will lose your tax exempt status. I think it is unconstitutional today. I think it is intimidating today. And I think if we got rid of it, and even if it was challenged, it would lose because it is unconstitutional in my perspective. And I think by many lawyers and attorneys, they would probably agree. But I think that's where we are today, that many pastors and leaders, and regardless, whether you're at a mosque, whether you're at a Christian church, whatever you are, they're silenced by the fear that, Congress may take away that nice little tax exempt status because if I speak out on an issue. And I think that's where we got to say, no, that's not really true.
Well, let me have a little, disagree with you slightly. Sure. It might be kind of fun to disagree right around that. I came to Washington to actually work for the General Board of Church and Society of the United Methodist Church. Most of the mainline denomination churches in this country, whether they're Methodist, Presbyterian, United Church of Christ, whether they are Church of the Brethren, Progressive National Baptist, all have lobbies in Washington, D.C. So indeed, as much as they don't endorse political candidates or political parties, they can advance their agenda.
Sure.
They can actually speak into the Congress and say, we want you to support passing legislation to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, house the homeless, care for the sick, or free the oppressed. They can do all those things, and they actually do it now. Right on the corner of Maryland and 1st Street Northeast on Capitol Hill is the United Methodist Building. In that building, it houses a number of these religious organizations that I just mentioned. They are there because they want to be able to advocate their policy positions of the church, how they view the world, the things they want to do to actually address or realize those policies, and they do it every day.
Mr. Shelton, so you think, as is, the church has the capacity to inject itself into political discourse?
Absolutely.
And it's a satisfactory system, if you will. Do you concur? Do you think?
I do think that we do have a system that you can absolutely go down there now and advocate. I think a lot of churches miss the point, one point, though,
Absolutely.
that all politics is really local, and then even at your state government aspect, that we still need to be engaged there as well as the Hill. But I think the other side is that the local pastor, the local church, oftentimes is removed from Congress and the Hill, and sometimes we forget that. And I know, just as I've engaged hundreds of pastors, that the concept of a 501c3 being threatened is one of the most
Absolutely.
forethought things in their mind for them speaking out in a political fashion on any side of the aisle.
Well, it's the issue of education. You're absolutely right.
Right.
I think if more people realize the power, the untapped power, ignorance
that's
creates
true.
fear.
Sure.
And quite frankly, this is an unnecessary fear in many ways. I actually brought forms, as a matter of fact. I want to sign everybody up here for our broadcast email action alert so you know what's going on in Capitol Hill. We're a C3, you're a C3. We want to make sure that people understand the power that they have to help bring these changes.
What are your thoughts about the government potentially injecting themselves into the church world by passing laws that might dictate what would be said from the pulpit?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
If you don't mind, I'll begin.
Sure.
As the Constitution is written right now, they're restricted from doing that.
Right.
They cannot interfere with your First Amendment right to freedom of speech, nor with what goes on and what you preach from the pulpit.
Sure.
There's not a piece of legislation that would ever get even the time of day on Capitol Hill that would infringe with that one way or another. There's still, however, there's an intimidation that happens. I think, as you mentioned before, we found ourselves as a C3 in a position where somebody didn't like what we said, so they called the IRS. The IRS came to investigate. We got better lawyers, so we got ourselves out of that trouble too and whatnot. We didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes it takes that. But nonetheless, I can see where a smaller church, with that kind of intimidation, you know in the final analysis, they're going to prove themselves to be right. But how much did it cost to get to that point?
Absolutely. Absolutely. With some of the hate speech laws that are on the horizon, and we've heard of some things that already happen in Europe, pastors are concerned about their capacity to teach certain scriptures to their congregation. What are your thoughts about that?
And that's exactly what I was thinking while he was talking. I said, you know, probably some years back I would be in his seat and say, there's no way in the world this would ever happen in our United States of America. The church would never be interfered, and there would be no interference from government about these issues. Well, let's look around. Move down the road here. If you look north of us in Canada, there are major laws and rules and regulations on what you can say and what you cannot say, what is broadcast and what is not broadcast. You start mentioning
lose your broadcast
you can
license,
lose your broadcast license if you're preaching certain things from your church and from the scripture and from the Bible, because guess what? That's declared as hate speech in there, and you will get fined. If you look at other pastors in other situations, especially when you deal with this whole marriage issue, you know, pastors have gotten to the point where they were fined and also even locked up, if you look at Aki Green and others folks, but not just, and sometimes people like to say, well, this is just hysteria. No, it's things that are beginning to encroach upon the religious freedoms that we now sit and we have been so privileged to enjoy. But I think what we're seeing is that slowly, step by step and incrementally, our religious freedoms are being slightly threatened. And if we don't stand up and take the space that you said is so freely given now, we could lose that space. It's kind of like if you don't occupy that space, you will lose that space.
Sure.
Y'all know how the government works sometimes, right? Okay, there you go.
Mr. Shelton, the tone, particularly, he mentioned the same-sex marriage issue, the tone is so toxic. I mean, if you disagree with now the prevalent position, and of course the position of our president, you're considered hateful, bigoted, etc. What is your thought about that tone? Because anyone that's marginalized or dehumanized, particularly, every day on the media and in our sitcoms, etc., eventually those folks can find themselves up against the corner, and some formal persecution, if you will, could happen. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there are a number of ways beyond the law, as a matter of fact, that this used to punish those who they disagree with. There's no question about it. As I mentioned, the NAACP got threatened as we were going into an election. They challenged us with electioneering, was the term they used, which is also something that's prohibited as a C3 and electioneering. We knew we were going to win, and we did, but it cost a lot of money to do it. So we had the best lawyers doing it and all that kind of thing. So I think we have those issues. However, I do think, as we talk about these issues, recognizing the power that we have and understanding how every step of the way our engagement with government is so important.
How do we get ahead of this then?
A number of ways. Number one is the values of the church are extremely important values. Whether you say, I'm a Baptist and here's my value, it doesn't matter what you call yourself. What matters is what you say and how you carry yourself.
Yeah, there's a core set of values.
It's a core set of values that you bring with you, that you should take with you to the polling place. You should take those values with you to the town hall meetings. True. You should take those values with you to the doors of Congress. Those values should go with you to City Hall and every place else. It's those values you want to move forward. With those values, if you're electing the right people, you know how one becomes a judge? One becomes a judge because the president nominates them. Sure. That means that as we're making our decisions, you make sure that you vote for people that carry your values as well. Sure. Then you end with the right judges and everything else.
So, what value trumps, if you will? I don't want to make this evening about the same-sex marriage issue, but it is the thing that everyone's talking about. And I'll be frank with you, I've never seen Christians this frightened before.
Well, they shouldn't be.
Okay.
They shouldn't be. Look, I consider myself born again as well, and I've been up close and watching how these things work. There's nothing in the policies around same-sex marriage that can interfere in any way whatsoever with how the church carries itself on. The church can decide who they want to marry regardless. The church can decide whether or not they want to recognize a marriage inside the church. The church has that authority, that power, that independence, and the constitutional protection to make sure the church can do just that.
Today.
That's
the
today.
Encroachment.
And the encroachment is the issue. Now, this is where I would probably say, yeah, but no, yes and no. You're going to say today the church can do this.
That's right.
But it's the mindful person that says, what about tomorrow? What about the future? What about the next generation?
Oh, sure.
And if you understand the subtle plot of this does not happen. I wrote a little piece today, you might have even received this, but that in less than 20 years, what was the Defense of Marriage Act, and we don't have to go down this total act, that was passed is now overturned in a portion. In a portion. Now, the interesting thing, that doesn't happen in the normal course of history that expedites that fast along. This stuff has been fast-tracked, and we are on a fast track to the encroachment of our religious freedoms, fast track to the encroachment of a lot of things that we hold near and dear. Now, the reason why I say that, if you listen, I was listening to a writer, a journalist just recently. She was on the radio, and this is quoted, but she said, you know what, we are, and she happens to be a gay journalist, but she said, I just want to be truthful today because we're really lying about our agenda. We're telling you that we want to have access to marriage, but really the truth is we want to access this marriage so that we can then get rid of marriage. The concept of marriage should be eradicated in society because everybody needs to be equal. She went on to then say that I have my kids, which I have 3 of, and she went into this long explanation of how this is all parsing out, have 5 parents, and they should all be legally accepted and legally provisioned for in our society, and then really the church should have no voice in that. And I say, see, that's where we get to when we have an opposing opinion beginning to inject themselves into society, and really it's walking in the doors almost of your church. And I'm not a guy that's saying, let's do the fear tactic, but I'm saying this is true stuff. This is not ethereal.
What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it is a theory because right now it's not reality. The truth to the matter, and this is where I would agree to disagree. We'll agree to disagree, and I appreciate that. I hope I can get a ride home after this.
Yes, you can. Yes, you can.
Okay. But we've always had these arguments of the fear of the next step. In essence, that once we do the right thing, somehow or another, it will continue to go to a point of ad nauseum and extreme.
Sure.
But that's not the case. That's not always the case. And as we talk about these issues, quite frankly, this is where I think I'd humbly disagree. I think right now, the policies are, what we're saying is that legally, now I want to talk about the difference between rights, R-I-T-E-S, religious rights, and civil rights, R-I-G-H-T-S.
Right.
They're quite different. When we talk about civil rights, regardless of whether we agree or disagree with someone, freedom of speech. I think people ought to be free to say whatever they want to until I disagree with them. So for instance, the question is, should the Klan be able to spew its venom and hatred? Well, the truth of the matter is, I'd rather they didn't. But I know that the same right that protects their ability to do that is the same right that allowed us to sue the government and have the March on Washington in 1963.
Sure. Very good.
It's the same set of ACLU lawyers. We say they are the Antichrist because they'll represent the Klan. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, they're God's own sent angels when they represent the NAACP.
Sure.
It's a whole different set of values. We just have to make sure that we're consistent with those principles and those values as we move forward. So we talk about taking care of families, taking care of children, making the decision under the law that someone will have the same rights to. When we talk about marriage as a civil right, what we're talking about is the power to decide whether we can enter into a set of contracts. Religious rights is a covenant. Civil rights is a contract. It's different. So we talk about being able to enter those contracts. Can I have a contract with a human being of the same gender in which if something happens to me, they'll take care of my children? Can we do the same thing? I know we're going to have some trouble here. That's all right. We're going to have some fun too. Do I have the right to enter the same set of contracts with somebody of the same gender that if something happens to me, they'll take care of the house? If something happens to me and I cannot make a decision about surgery that needs to be done on me, can I sign a contract with somebody of the same gender as I am in which they're given the responsibility of making the decision about what's going to happen with my health care while I'm incapacitated? Sure. That's the civil rights. When we talk about religious rights, it's something very different.
Yeah.
Sure, exactly.
But help me, gentlemen.
Exactly.
Before the Supreme Court did what it did as it relates to marriage,
Sure.
couples had a right to enter into contracts.
Yes.
So
Nobody ever took that away.
But it was quite limited. And as we talk about things like the contracts that also give you governmental benefits. You could not get those governmental benefits before, but now you can.
Yeah, from a DOMA perspective, I would agree.
So my point is, why not?
I think, but from a DOMA perspective, yeah, I agree. And that's really a lot of the conversations we've had with many people. We said, I'm not opposed to anybody getting rights.
That's right.
Or their benefits. However, I'm opposing to the redefinition of what we know as marriage in our society. Now, and when people try and tell you that no, we're not redefining marriage, let's say, what book are you reading and what society are you living in? That's absolutely not true. That is what's taking place. And so a portion of DOMA was stuck in, and then rights were afforded. However, just like you had mentioned, people have the right, and I've said this from day one, people have the right to enter into legal contracts with whomever they want to enter into. And matter of fact, when you hear the sob stories about, well, I lost this, I wasn't able to do this because of, I didn't have this afforded to me because I was a couple. I said, no, you didn't have it afforded to you because you didn't have a will. If a married couple, heterosexual, does not have the appropriate paperwork and contractual arrangements and stuff done and a will done, guess what? You're still going to be out.
Well, not necessarily.
To some degree, there are provisions that you will still be out. Now, I do know the minutia of the law, you're exactly right. There are some things that were afforded by DOMA. But at the same time, you cannot tell me that you cannot enter into a legal contract. You can. And I think this is not about benefits and rights. And they have, by and large, the gay movement, by and large, has moved away from that argument completely. They haven't even pushed that argument in the last few years.
Well, let me clear up something real quick so I don't get in any trouble.
All right.
I'm a heterosexual married man. I have 3 children, and I love my wife. So I don't want that to preclude anything I'm saying, because they go like, something's wrong with that, brother. No. Look, it's all of that. But quite frankly, as we talk about these issues, I think at some point we have to be very fair about human beings.
I agree with that, but help me a little bit as a pastor. Sure. This, for me, is not really far down the road. I pastor thousands of people here, and I sit with parents, and now what's happening in schools, kids have to opt out of certain programs. They feel ostracized because of it. If there's a discussion in class and they disagree with a position of the teacher, particularly on this issue, and a teacher advocates a certain thing, or things can be said in a lot of different ways without people being very specific, that child is frowned upon. I've even had situations now in school, boys and girls used to kiss against the lockers. Now you have boys and boys, girls and girls. And now I have issues with parents coming to me and saying, well, a little boy made a pass at my son, and my son had a visceral response and clocked him or did whatever he did, and now he's suspended. And how do you tell a boy, you know what?
He's intolerant.
If a guy comes at you that way, you're just going to have to explain to him. I mean, how do you do that? And this is the culture we're now creating, and it's quite complicated.
Well, let me say this. There's no place for violence, period.
Okay.
No matter what you call it. There's no place.
If you're defending your body,
I
think you should.
If somebody physically, if somebody physically accosts you, you should have the right to physically.
At you physically to kiss you or what have you.
I'm not about that.
It's visceral.
But I'm not about that. Look, how many times?
There is a self-defense law.
Well, there is. And if indeed somebody's physically accosting you, then you have the right to defend yourself physically. But let me say this.
There are touches, there are all types. The thing has gotten very, very compounded. And the point is.
Here's what I want you to think about.
Yes.
If a young man walks up to a young woman and he's feeling very nice things about her and wants to touch her, she has the right to deflect that.
Yes.
And I think the same thing is true of all human beings. Because the point I'm making is, I think that very well sometimes we allow some exceptions to treating people as less than full human beings.
That's not the case.
And it's time for us to get past those prejudices.
But if you try to violate me physically,
then you have a right to defend yourself.
Yes, and the line. Now I'm not in the debate, so I'm gonna pull back.
All right. That's fair. That's fair.
He got a couple sons, so I got you.
And he's doing just fine. So,
There's certain lines that men have, and young boys in particular have, and it might be healthy for them to have that at that particular point in their development.
That's right.
And I think it's unfortunate now for us to have to tell boys you may have to take some flirting and et cetera and all the rest. So listen, you should never beat up on anybody.
Make a distinction between flirting.
Yes.
Is something that's done vocally.
Not always.
Well, I think where we
are.
Putting
your hands on somebody, that's different.
Okay.
Well, I think where we are, though.
I'm out of the debate, and I'm talking about it too.
Very good.
Well, let me interject this one. I think where we are, and your mere question of that, and even the response, and you see, it is complicated.
Yes,
but the issue that we're at is, you're going to stand up on a Sunday morning, or not even just a Sunday morning. As a dad, guess what I'm going to do? And this is what I say about my president as well. As a dad, I'm going to genuinely tell my two boys and my girl, I want you to grow up. I want you to do your best in education, get the education you want to get. I want the best for you in your life. And I want you, young men, to find a wonderful woman to marry one day. And I'm going to tell my daughter the same thing, but I'm going to say, I want you to find a good man who got a job, a vision, a perspective. You see what I'm saying? Now, hear me. And this is where I have all due respect for my president. I have all due respect and honor for that office. But even when he stood up and said, I'm evolving to this, and I thought about this, and I even took some of Hillary Clinton's, Hillary Clinton, Michelle Obama's clips from when the DNC speech. Because I said, if you heard the concept of her speech, she believes wholeheartedly in the concept of a marriage between a man and a woman, and that fundamental belief in her own household. The thing that I don't get is that I know he's not going to sit at home one day and tell his daughters, Sasha and Malia, I can't wait till you grow up and you find a good woman that you could take care of and you marry. Now,
I don't know him.
I don't know him, but I would doubt that in my mind. Now, I don't know. He could be open-minded to the point where that's the thing that they're now pushing. But the principle is, we're teaching kids something, and I'm teaching my kids their value system. You're teaching many families their value, how to construct that. Sure. And then what they're finding in society, in our school system, whether public or private, in society in general, down at the street, at the mall, whatever may be the case, if you slip and say one thing, if you have any reaction to anybody who is in that lifestyle, they have been elevated almost beyond any status to me as an African American back in the day when we were struggling, because I'm thinking, man, it's as if there's a hypersensitivity out here that look at the ball players, look at anybody who texts anything remotely offensive or anything. And then you compare that even with today's Paula Deen issue. I mean, we're still debating Paula Deen, but if she said anything gay, guess what? She would have been fined, off the air. I mean, you might as well lock up.
Very good. Let's be fair before we turn the
Sorry.
corner. Any comments, any thoughts about what was just said?
No, I think it's important that we instill values into our children.
Sure.
Values to respect human beings, understanding the value, the strength of the family, understanding it does take a man and a woman to have a baby, and the responsibilities our boys have. If you make a baby, you need to be the daddy.
Yeah.
All those things are
I
important.
agree with that.
And before you do that, you should find a good partner, a good wife. As a matter of fact, this going to be there to work with you and everything along those lines. There's no question about all those issues and whatnot as well. However, I would argue that there's nothing in what we just described that should preclude anyone else, as long as they don't interfere with me and mine, from being able to enjoy their lives how they see fit. And I believe in by and by. I believe that God is going to make his decisions, and I believe there are parables in the Bible. I don't want to preach to a preacher,
Sure.
but I think there's a story of the wheat sower that threw the seeds out, and I believe there was concern about his enemy sneaking in and planting weeds among the seeds, and that indeed what he was told is wait and see what grows of it,
Sure.
and then make your decisions. I think as we look at these issues and whatnot as well, I think it is a real problem we begin prejudging along these lines as well. I think our values tell us that we respect each other as human beings, and that must be carried the day. That's what I teach my boys, and I'm very happy with what they're growing into.
Sure. Let me ask you another question. Why do you think in society, particularly the media, most worldviews are embraced, accepted, celebrated, and certainly tolerated? But when you start talking about that singular name, you can't mention the name of Jesus in the prayer. When you start talking about a New Testament worldview, all of a sudden you're a flake, you're a weirdo, or I happen to be an independent, but I might be considered a right-winger because of that, et cetera. Why is that the case?
I don't know. It's a left-right battle that I'm still trying to figure out myself. I mean, you're talking to a guy that goes on Capitol Hill and lobbies every day for the NAACP. I spent half of my professional career actually lobbying the church's moral positions to the U.S. Congress. I get to see the president about once a week in the White House. And he is a very nice guy, by the way. I do believe he carries those Christian values with him. And I've seen how
that's why you missed lunch with me, because you had to meet with the president.
Yeah, I apologize for that too, man. But we will make up. We will make up for that. We'll make up for that. And that's the problem with dealing with the president. When he wants to see you, got to see him there.
The king is the king.
So I appreciate that as well. But I do believe, as we're talking about these issues, that understanding the rights of everyone, and perhaps there is some divine reason that things are working out the way they are, whether it's to teach a lesson. You know, we learn from the things we do successfully and the mistakes we make as well. I think with that in mind, respecting humanity, the principles that are laid down in our gospels as Christians, I think it will help us carry the day regardless.
I agree. I think it is the thing that teaches the lesson. And the lesson that I've been deriving out of this, and I think many of us need to, is Scripture teaches to occupy till I come. And we have not occupied places that we need to be in. The mountain of media and the place of media, you know, we were sitting back thinking everything's going to be all right, and as long as we get on in the sweet by and by. But guess what? While we were doing that, and while we were in a sense sleeping, guess what? People were occupying those positions. People were occupying the positions of media. People were occupying the positions of political offices. If you look in political offices today, the reason why we're here to some degree, legislative assistants, aides, and everybody else on the Hill and in our state government, whether it be Democrat, Republican, or independent, you would be overwhelmed with the amount of people, and I'm just going to be honest and say it, who are gay and who are in these positions. Because guess what? When they're sitting in the office, they're answering the phone, I'm just coming to get a job. But guess what? When he comes in the office, I get to talk to him a little bit. Tell him, you know, I'm just a regular person just like you.
That's right.
And all of a sudden, they're influencing him with their lifestyle, which is fine. But guess what? I have values, I have perspective, I know who I am, and we need to teach and train our kids and our young people and us as adults, because we can't abandon as adults, that we have to occupy those positions and be in those places. We can't just come home, do our traffic thing, which I know is rough around here, and really not be in positions of influence And we have to think, sometimes we've thought a lot about our pocketbook, but we forgot about the positions that are influencing the most. And media influences culture.
So, Pastor,
Oh,
from
without
your
question.
comments,
I agree
yeah,
with you. I agree with
you feel that the influence of the church has been diminished in the last few years. What are your thoughts? Do you think the church has been diminished?
you. Well, I think in some ways it has.
Yeah, okay.
But certainly popular culture is quite powerful.
Yeah.
Man, my children use everything from the PlayStation 3. They've got their PDAs, watching the movies they want to watch, channel what they want to channel. They're listening to the music they want to listen to, and it's not as open as it used to be.
Sure.
You used to have the radio turned on in the car so everybody knew what everybody else was listening to, or the stereo turned on in the house. No. Nowadays, the things that's plugged in and
Sure.
whatnot, you don't know half of what they're hearing
Sure. Yeah.
or half of what they're saying.
Sure.
So I appreciate that. But what that does is tell us, in my opinion, that those values of the church become even much more important for us to instill in them.
Sure.
That is all about the filters we create. They're all kind of things that are vying for attention. The devil's pretty powerful and bright person too.
Yeah.
He goes after some sneaky ways that we couldn't even dream of, and I appreciate that as well.
Yeah.
But I do believe
I don't
that.
appreciate
Look, anytime you can create a system like slavery, let me start there.
Yeah.
We're in the cradle of the South when we're sitting here in Virginia. If you can create a system like slavery, but you can have people that go to church every Sunday, preaching to the same God we're preaching to, but then end up finding that in the very constitution of the Ku Klux Klan, it's a clause that says you have to be a born-again Christian to be a member.
Wow.
Now, so you begin to wonder, what does that really mean then?
Sure.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily about, in my opinion, what you say, it's about what you believe.
Okay.
It's about understanding how to filter through what's in front of you.
Sure.
I think that's what God provides us with, and that's what this teaching is all about in institutions just like this one.
Very good. And you just brought me to my next question here. What do you think? Now, in my opinion, there's only one church. There's not a black church, a white church, a Korean church. It's one body of Christ. But why do you think there's a division in what the media will call the evangelical church and what is called the traditional African American church? Why the division?
The why, I guess, has to begin with kind of the what first. It's in the social principles. The church has a number of different sets of doctrine, whether we identify it that way or not. One is the core, almost constitutional. It's core to everything. You judge everything that happens in your life based on that set of principles. That set of principles is realized in a set of social principles. That is, how do you apply those teachings and that foundation into the world today? So I believe the challenge becomes, the church becomes segmented as we have those who are vying for whatever the audience is, usually for greed. That's the reason I started with the issue of the institution of slavery. Slavery is abhorrent, and it still goes on today.
Yeah, sure.
If you think about it for a minute, under slavery, you had those that would actually raise children up to sell them off, not give them any rights to decide who their partner in life is going to be. Yeah. You had those that would actually punish you severely, cutting off limbs to be able to teach a lesson. It was horrific. You had no rights. They didn't even give you the right to praise God the way you wanted to praise God.
Sure.
But we figured out a way through that anyway.
Yeah, we sure did.
So the issue is that we know that even as we're confronting these issues today, that we've got these slicker movements. We say in the civil rights community, we won the battle to defeat Jim Crow. We buried Jim Crow years ago. But James E. Crow, Esquire, is alive and well and more fundamentally engaged and slicker than ever before. Now, if there was ever a comparison between God and the devil, that would be it.
Okay. Let me ask you a question, Pastor McCoy. Groups such as yours, the Maryland Family Alliance, you're often defined as a pro-family group. You often speak on issues like abortion, same-sex marriage, etc. But the internet search finds that you have almost a radio silence when it comes to the issue of social justice issues that pertain to folks that are suffering and struggling in life. Why have you not been equally as vocal in those areas?
Well, I think that brings us to what is going on in our modern day society. You speak out on marriage, guess what? You get a mic. You speak out on abortion, guess what? That's a modern political issue. Now, if you go and talk about education, nobody's going to listen to you. If you talk about how do we help these kids and try and find school choice opportunities like the kids in D.C. and try and help them find opportunities, which has been a great system in getting into schools and getting into opportunities where they can have a good education. you're not going to get, nobody's going to be ringing your chain to talk about that issue. And if you're looking at the stuff that I do in Baltimore City and with a lot of other pastors and stuff that we've done, nobody's going to talk about those issues. We're in the middle of a movement now to actually help some of the inner city people, along with the police, one of the top police chiefs in the Baltimore City area, and trying to actually help change some communities there, because we all know dropout ratio is nearing 78 to 80%.
So you're saying the media only covers you on
the
that
media
issue?
covers you absolutely on those issues that are most politically charged, I would say.
But you are involved in other issues?
Yeah, I'm definitely involved in some of those issues, and I'm concerned about my communities at all levels. It's not just abortion, not just marriage, and because I think it's fundamentally that we're supposed to be engaged in our full community.
Sure.
And now I might not carry the title of NAACP, but at the same time, these guys are supposed to be advocating for some of our issues as well.
Right.
And we do.
And that's why they're there. So, but I do think but even if you look at, and maybe make this one tie, and I'll leave it alone, because since I'm already charged with that issue anyway, people like to lump marriage and abortion into this thing, and then all of a sudden they make a quick conclusion. Oh, that's right wing. No. These are issues of our day. They don't come with the political tag of Democrat, Republican, or independent. They come with the tag of what's right and what's wrong, what's justice, what's not. I honestly look at abortion as a social justice issue. And people say, well, that's a women's issue. No, I look at it as a fundamental life issue. The reason why is because I don't get the opportunity to say when life begins and when life ends and what I can kill and what I can't. And if you look at the subtle issue of this that really gets me going, is the black issue in this whole aspect of abortion is amazing. We account for over 2/3 of all the abortions in the country, but yet we're only 1/3 of the population. What's going on there? It started by Margaret Sanger, who was really she wanted to eliminate our race within culture, purify the race. She was one of those folks, a eugenist. And so if you start to understanding the history behind that, you said, everybody should be appalled with this, but yet we're now pushing that agenda and saying it's okay. Why not? And I think we're finding is that more people are becoming what they would consider very concerned about life at these days. And I think that's one of those things I can't tell my kids when I stand up, and regardless of what any church thinks about me, but when I stand up and I talk about this to my own children and my own family, and I say, you know what? Even if you ever make a mistake in your life and you say, well, somebody's impregnated, you don't have the right to choose when that child's life ends.
Mr. Shelton.
Which is why I'm sure you're very strongly against the death penalty. Yeah. Same here.
Okay, very good. I have this is going to be the final question of the evening, actually. How does the NAACP choose the issues that it champions? You've supported same-sex marriage. Why haven't you spoken out against abortion and that type of thing, considering its racist roots, as the pastor just mentioned? What are your thoughts? How do you select?
Well, let me first tell you how we select our issues.
Yes.
It's a very democratic small d process.
Okay.
We have about 2,200 units throughout the United States, but also in Italy, Germany, Korea, and Japan on military bases. Mm-hmm. As the military was integrating, they actually asked the NAACP to step in and actually help with that internal process, because they knew there'd be major problems anytime you have an institutions function in a segregated way as it has for so long. So 4 countries outside the United States, all U.S. citizens as well. Every year, just before May 1st, any member can submit a resolution to be considered by the full body of delegates at our national convention through the resolutions committee process in July. As a matter of fact, I'd like to invite everyone here to come to Orlando, Florida from July the 11th through the 17th as we make those decisions. 2,200 delegates are elected from all over the country, here in the state of Virginia and every place else throughout.
So black people were not interested in abortion? Well,
let me say that the issues come up, and it was decided that we would not take a position on abortion very specifically. But let me finish telling you how the process works, because I think that was the first question you asked, and we'll talk about the issues too.
Yeah.
Sure. The way the process works then is, once those issues are on the floor, those 2,200 delegates debate, discuss, amend, support, or oppose. It's passed or defeated. It's then submitted to a 64-member board of directors, elected nationwide as well. Their job is to see to their implementation. The process of that implementation goes to staff, people like myself. President and CEO Benjamin Todd Jellis is a primary employee of that national board. His job is to make sure he has staff that can actually implement those policies. When it comes to policies on Capitol Hill, it's the Washington Bureau that actually moves those through. I happen to be the director of the Washington Bureau as I serve as Senior Vice President for Policy and Advocacy. On the issue of abortion, it's been discussed but decided that we would not take a position on it. The NAACP is silent, not supporting nor opposing, but the NAACP has a fundamental position that women should be able to control their reproductive lives.
Sure, one of the best ways to control it is, of course, not to find yourself in that position.
Oh, absolutely, sure.
But let me ask you a question. Forgive me, I've lived a little while. You're a little grayer than I am.
I'm premature, bro.
Yeah, you're premature, okay. But most votes can be guided. If the NAACP leadership was serious about that issue, it would inform its membership, and you would see senior leaders trying to influence the body of the NAACP. You really don't see a lot of that, considering the number of abortions that are done in the African American community.
Well, let me say the debate and discussion still happens.
Okay.
Within that body, that 64-member board, again, these are all leaders that are sitting together at the table. One of the most challenging things to ever do is sit down with a whole bunch of folks that are already leaders somewhere.
Yeah.
And try to get them to agree on something. I think Congressman Scott from Virginia once referred to that as trying to herd kittens.
Yes.
It takes quite a bit of doing, as a matter of fact.
We do some of that around here.
I bet you. It happens every place. But the point is, I think we have those debates and those discussions. And we simply decided at one point that we are the nation's oldest and largest civil rights organization. And under that guise, there are other organizations working on the abortion rights issue. It's very divisive within the African American community. What you find is that most African Americans will tell you that they personally don't believe in abortion. But quite frankly, most of the African Americans I've talked to don't believe they should interfere with other people's rights to make that decision. It's quite different. You should have the power to make that decision yourself, and whatever power runs through you, it helps you make that decision, you'll make the right decision.
Well, very good. I want to thank both of you gentlemen for this discussion this evening. But I want to thank you, Pastor McCoy, for coming out in the traffic in the rain, and you, Mr. Shelton, as well. I think we've all learned some things, and our goal was to help folks begin to think through their political positions. At this church in particular, and I know folks here from a lot of different churches, I don't tell people how to vote. That's not my job. I don't consider that my role. But it is my job to preach and teach the principles of Scripture. And I do take issue, though, with folks that would support party above principle. And we have to break that.
Amen.
And that's why I call myself an independent. But my hope is that in these discussions, you can begin to think through, what does the Scripture say? What does my conscience say about the various issues that we're going to discuss in the upcoming forums? God bless you guys, and I thank you, man. The rain, the traffic, you guys came out. You guys are serious, and I appreciate you. Once again, would you give yourselves a hand of applause and the gentleman that came out tonight? God bless you.
Great job.